Yeah, let's get going. Just be aware of everybody's time. Appreciate everybody uh, attending for today. Welcome 2021. Looks like the pandemic certainly continues, hot and heavy, right? But I hopefully everybody can kind of see a finish line in the not too distant future, hopefully, and hopefully everybody's been able to stay safe and have a great holiday season since we last met. So I would like to we'll get started with our speaker. I'm pleased to have James Gorman from the Pond and Lake Connection share some valuable information on how to maintain our ponds using BMPs and the latest technology. James received his bachelor's degree from SUNY Delhi. Welcome, James. I'm from Delhi too. He was in plant science, so I was in horticulture. So, but I think I was maybe a year or two just ahead of you, maybe, because he graduated in 2002. And he works for the Pond and Lake Connection for the past 10 years as an aquatic specialist. The Pond and Lake Connection service over 600 ponds and lakes throughout the tri-state area for invasive and nuisance vegetation, water quality issues, and overall water health. So we have a lot of surface water and a lot of ponds, James, in Rockland County, and we would be remiss if we weren't, as a water quality committee, thinking about that water in our county. So with that, I'll turn it over to you, and looking forward to what you've got to say in your presentation.
Good morning, everybody. Thanks for having me. Thanks to the Water Quality Coordinating Committee for having me. Before we get going, Nicole, we'll just, you're good with your agenda? We'll start sharing the screen and get the presentation going. Is there anything else you want to do or let everybody know about before we do that?
Yes, James. Thank you. I just wanted to add, for the sake of the recording, as per New York State Open Meeting Law, Executive Order 202.87, all public meetings can be held virtually through January 29th. So that's why this continues to be virtual. Hopefully the board will discuss if we want to continue with virtual versus in-person once things change. But for now, we'll be remaining virtual. So James will present his screen to share his presentation, and I will go on mute. This is just a reminder that we'll save all questions for the end. And if you want to type in your question as James is talking, you could type it into the chat bar and we'll get to it at the end. Oh, James, you're muted, just so you know.
Thank you. Better? There we go. Thank you. Thanks for having me again. This is, I've only done a few of these Zoom talks, so bear with me, please. I'm used to more having a interrupt me in the middle of a talk. Let's get to it kind of question talk, but let's get going here. So thanks again, Matt. It was a good introduction. The objective of this presentation is to do a little bit about weed ID. We'll go through some of the options that we have for managing the vegetation. Once we ID what our problem is, we're going to discuss manual and mechanical removal. We'll discuss some of the biological controls available, some of the chemical controls available, and some of the fountain and aeration systems. Obviously, with anything, you want the right management. You need to have the right ID for the plant. Most methods target specific plants or groups of vegetation that grow in a similar manner. For aquatics, there's about 4 groups. Everything kind of falls into these 4 groups. There's immersed vegetation, floating vegetation, algae, and submerged vegetation. Proper ID is going to allow us to have proper management techniques. ID will help us determine if you can do it yourself or if you need to have somebody else. But I'm guessing you're probably not going to have seaweed growing in your freshwater pond. The first thing we're going to get into are algae. It's the most common problem. They range from microscopic in size to these big long sheets that are all mixed together and branched together. Algae doesn't have any seeds, doesn't have any flowers. They fall into two main groups. The first group is Planktonic Algae. This is the microscopic algae. It's free floating, usually stays in the water column, or it's right at the top of the surface. It needs to stay where there's enough light for photosynthesis. So it's rare to find planktonic algae in 8 feet of water. You know, we usually think about it as the top 2 to 3 feet of the water problem. Planktonic algae normally has this like pea soup look to the pond, or if we go back to this last slide, some people say that that looks like spilled paint. So, you know, if I was talking to somebody over the phone and we were going through it, that pea soup or the spilled paint look is, you know, a good indicator of what you got. Planktonic algae often has a bad odor, and it can be harmful to animals like dogs if they drink it a lot, or think about them cleaning themselves off after being in a pond. You know, they're basically licking the algae off themselves. Technically, planktonic algae is the beginning of the aquatic food chain, but it falls into the category of too much of a good thing. And algae explodes, specific planktonic algae explodes based on nutrients. Planktonic algae comes in all different colors. Back here, it was, you can see where it's like a blue-green. You know, here it's like a dull green. Here it's kind of swirling. You know, here it's red. There's some that can be blue, grays, white. Sometimes it gets foamy. So depending on the water temperature and just whatever's going on in your environment, it can be all different kinds. Technically, the ocean has this. This is what red tide is. It's the same idea. The other type of algae is filamentous algae. This is the pond scum. It gets in these dense mats of hair. I've heard people describe it as insulation, you know, fiberglass insulation. It can degrade the water quality, and it certainly impacts recreational enjoyment. Filamentous algae usually grows along the bottom of a pond, and as it produces algae, or as it produces oxygen, it gets trapped in those thick mats, and that's what helps float it up. That's why it's frequently called an algae bloom, because it kind of just blooms up out of nowhere. It can be an overnight thing. You can look out at your pond and go, I don't have algae, the surface is clear. And then the next day it could easily be, you know, half the pond with stuff floating up. Filamentous algae tends to be a persistent problem. You can treat it, scoop it out. It's just going to keep going back because you haven't changed the environment at all. It'll reproduce rapidly. Large quantities of algae depend on nutrients, specifically phosphorus. So usually if you have a lot of phosphorus, you'll get a lot of algae. Just like planktonic algae comes in all different colors. This is like a real, this isn't a bad picture. It's actually really just kind of yellowy orange looking. Filamentous algae doesn't really have any benefits to the ecosystem. Fish will eat it, but it's really got to be like a last resort for them. Really, the only thing I could say that anything benefits from filamentous algae is that it's an opportunity for small fish to hide from bigger fish. Insects, you know, there's a lot of aquatic insects in that hide from birds. So, you know, from that standpoint, it's good. But otherwise, there's real no benefits. Sometimes we could be looking at an algae problem, and it's actually from submerged vegetation that grows up to the top. What ends up happening is that top inch of the water gets super warm, and it acts like a greenhouse, and the algae can just explode. So we can look at a pond and go, oh, I got algae, but it could be one of those, hey, is that your real problem, or is it a symptom of another problem? Here's just another picture of a pond. This is kind of like your typical light green algae. Here's another picture of it where it's black. Just like everything else, depending on your water quality, your situation, the depth of the water, the time of year, it could come in all different colors. So you can't really use color as a way to identify this. Second thing we're going to talk about are floating weeds. They stay on the surface of the water, and they obtain their nutrients from the water, not the soil. I would say the two most common in our area are duckweed and watermeal. As you can see from the picture, they're super, super tiny. Technically, duckweed is good for a pond. A lot of things eat it, not just ducks. But, you know, again, too much of a good thing. If it covers the pond, it's not going to be good. They tend to explode pretty rapidly. They reproduce asexually, so you just need one and it'll start taking over a pond. In 2 weeks, duckweed can go from one seed to daughtering about 17,000 plants, depending on the water temperature in the middle of the summertime. So that's how duckweed is able to take over a pond very quickly. Same thing with watermeal. When watermeal gets in about 80-degree water, it can double in a day. Not only is it an insect problem, but it can create fish kills. The shading of the sunlight limits photosynthesis that the submerged vegetation is doing, which is mostly how water gets in a natural body, or oxygen gets in a natural body of water. Also, when it covers the entire pond like this, it keeps the atmosphere from interacting with the water, which is another way that a pond gets oxygen. So this oxygen gets absorbed by the plants at night, and this continuing cycle of more plants, less oxygen being made, and oxygen getting absorbed at night can lead to fish kills. Duckweed and watermeal are transferred from pond to pond pretty easily. That's how I kind of stay in business, specifically because of duckweed and watermeal and our turtle friends. Boats will move it, and even the outflow of a pond. You know, you get a nice little thunderstorm, the duckweed watermeal skims off and it goes down to the neighbor's pond. Park ponds are usually perfect for excessive amounts of duckweed and watermeal. They're shallow, they're usually collection ponds, and they tend to have a lot of geese. As we all know, geese are, the fecal matter is high in phosphorus. And the other problem with geese is that the fecal matter usually gets in the pond pretty quick. It's in the watershed, it's in the water. And because these plants get their nutrients from the water, you know, it's really easy for them to get a quick shot, even by a flock moving in and moving out of phosphorus, and can take right off. The third type of vegetation we're going to talk about is emergent vegetation. These are rooted at the bottom of the pond and grow up, but their leaves, stems, flowers, almost all their parts extend above the water surface. They primarily occur along the shoreline and in shallow water. Frags, cattails, irises, rushes, they're kind of the most common emergent vegetation. These are usually pretty good for ponds, depending on how much there are. Their seeds are huge food sources for a lot of birds. They provide a ton of nesting habitat for birds that aren't necessarily aquatic birds. Turtles, all kinds of different animals can hide out in these areas. It provides good shelter and shade from the sun in the summertime. The problem is when, of course, just like anything else, you get an overabundance. They can block access to beaches. It prohibits recreational activities. You can't really fish along the side of a pond if you got a 10-foot wall of frags or cattails growing around the edge. And then in worst case scenarios, it'll eliminate areas for fish breeding. The big fish can't get into these shallow areas to lay eggs. Another problem with emergent vegetation is that they tend to trap debris, garbage. That stuff can accumulate over time. Even in this picture, all the dead leaves from years past growth, you know, can look bad. So even if we weren't looking at bottles of garbage there, we'd still be looking at dead plant life from years past. All that stuff adds up. The layers of organic matter keep building up for years and years. And you kind of get rid of the water, that water disappears. The last type of weeds we're going to talk about are the submerged vegetation. It's the most abundant section of vegetation. I would say in our area, there's probably 20 varieties of submerged vegetation that can grow on a pond. They're rooted at the bottom. They tend to grow right up to the surface. Submerged plants are critical to a well-structured fish population. They provide protection for the small fish from larger fish. They produce large numbers of invertebrates for small fish to eat. Fish and invertebrates like to lay their eggs on the underside of stuff. So some of the pondweed species that have bigger leaves, that are underwater allow spots for the fish to lay the eggs on the underside of stuff. They're an important food source for all your ducks and waterfowl, and they produce oxygen for the water bodies through photosynthesis. Some of the accidental problems that you have with pond vegetation is that they tend to attract animals. If you get muskrats coming, that's not going to be good depending on the pond or park situation that you got with their burrowing. It creates erosion. We've had muskrats cause ponds to leak because they're, of course, they're digging on the dam side of the pond. And then everybody's walked along the edge and stepped in one of these before it really create a problem in a public situation. Also, another accidental problem, if you will, is that they tend to clog outlets and drains, and it can cause some flooding. This is a golf course here, and you can see those bushes or grasses way out there in the middle of what is the pond, and that's actually the edge of the pond. This was a situation in which a 2-foot pipe is the drain pipe for the golf course, and it got jammed up with a bunch of stuff. Now we got some flooding. The golf course ended up having to net fish out of sand traps, and they had to rake all that plant life off of the grass because it was just caking on there and it was going to kill the stuff. So, some unintended, weed problems by having vegetation. Typically, aquatic plants are not desired, at high levels. It doesn't matter what you're using the water for. And we just got to do education to the owners of the ponds or the users of the ponds to let them know the benefits of having vegetation. Plants are critical to fish and wildlife, nesting, food, coverage, whatever you're trying to do. And, I usually tell people if it's not a swimming pool, let's not treat it that way. So having vegetation is good. We just need to make it be where we need it to be. You have situations in which you want to use your pond as a swim pond. Having vegetation in the pond might not necessarily be desirable. However, in this pond here, you got some rooted vegetation along the bottom. It's rooted. It's not going to move out into the swim area. So if these guys had floating vegetation, that would be annoying. However, because it's rooted, it doesn't go anywhere. You can keep an eye on it. It allows them to jump off their dock and go swimming without having any problems and allow the pond to have vegetation. Conversely, a fishing place really wants to have the rooted vegetation not at their immediate shoreline, but out in the water so that they can cast out to where the vegetation is, but have a clear reel back in, if you will, with their lure. So determining what the goal of the pond is, what the use of the pond is, will help us determine the solution. We'll figure out what the weed is, what their goal is, and work backwards from there. We use Texas A&M and Purdue have really good websites for identifying vegetation. They have it based on picture. It's broken down into the groups. So if you go, look, I know I got a floating vegetation, I've got a floating weed here. You can go to their section and hit floating weeds, and then it asks you, is it multi-leaf? Is it branched? Is it this? Is it that? And it'll really help you narrow down what you're looking at, or at least get you into a family. So I have them as direct links on my phone because I use it often. So I would recommend that for anybody to just look for. There's another website called Weeders Digest, and they do a lot with aquatic weeds, and they're more of the shoreline grasses and vegetation. So if that's something you guys want to write down, they're good websites to have to help with your ID. We talked a little bit about ID, and we'll do a little bit about actually managing them now. So there's really only 4 ways that we can deal with vegetation in the Northeast. So you have manual or mechanical removal. There's some biological controls. Obviously, there's chemical controls, and there's fountain and air systems. The first thing is manual and mechanical removal. They offer like a green solution, if you will, to a weed problem. The methods include harvesters, rakes, and actually vegetation. Some of the pros of mechanical removal are you can open up these cuts or paths through the weed bed. So if you have a large lake, you really just need to get access out to a certain part of it. You can cut these kayak paths through or these boating paths through, kind of let everything else go. And we have our nice little runway. We have our kayak path. We have our whatever that allows us to get through. And it's immediate results. You know, the guy goes through with the machine, picks it up, and you're good to go. With mechanical removal, you're removing the vegetation, so you're removing the nutrients that are in the vegetation. So as long as you don't pile that up right on the shoreline, that leaches and breaks down, goes back in the water, as long as you get that out of its immediate watershed, you know, you're getting rid of the vegetation and the nutrient. Most of the mechanical machines allow you to do floating vegetation. You can see this machine here is actually just going around and scooping up algae, and submerged vegetation as well can be removed. One of the problems with mechanical removal is usually you need deep water to get these big machines in there. They don't really work that well in shallow areas. They are amphibious, but you know, you need the water to be able to get the stuff to scoop up. You know, it's part of the system. So most of the vegetation is moved manually. You know, it allows you to remove what you don't want and leave what you do want. You have the flexibility to work around docks in shallow areas. You know, if you need to get near an intake line or going back to our pipes are clogging up, we just really need to clear out this 10-foot by 10-foot spot to keep the water moving. You know, this is the way to do it. Also, there's no special skills or education or really equipment. You could literally just throw a rake in and do it, a pitchfork. There's lots of ways to do it, relatively inexpensive. If you're doing it in the summertime, you don't have to wear waders or anything like that. You can just get right in the water. Some of the disadvantages of manual and mechanical removal is that, you know, depending on the plant, it can regrow, it can recolonize the area. You may need to do it a couple times a year. We equate it to kind of mowing the lawn or mowing a field. The other thing is that most aquatic plants can regrow from fragments. So if you are pulling that stuff out, you got to get every little piece. And because it's difficult to collect all those fragments, a lot of times you can't do it in deeper water. Once you get to a spot that you can't stand anymore and be able to get everything, you know, it's really difficult in 8 feet of water to manually remove everything and to get all the fragments. Some of the bigger machines, they're not going to be able to differentiate wildlife from plant material, and you're going to unintentionally harvest turtles, fish, frogs, salamanders. We talked about the eggs getting laid on the underside of plants before. So depending on the season, you can be bringing all the fish eggs out, you know, along with the vegetation. So it's kind of a timing thing. And, you know, the bigger machines, there's just nothing you can do about unintentionally bringing in, you know, aquatic invertebrates. And you got to deal with the plants once they're out of the water. Size of the pond, size of the weed problem, you can literally produce tons of vegetation. You got to have access for the equipment, and you're going to need a staging area. Trucking the material off-site can get expensive, and we actually have a very difficult time finding places that'll take it. A lot of times when we're doing small ponds, I'll call up the nearest golf course and just try and barter with them and be like, hey, look, can we bring this trailer load of stuff and throw it in the dump, you know, with your leaves and stuff. There is one type of machine that I wanted to talk to you guys about. It's this skimmer, and it's designed to remove floating vegetation. That's it. So your duckweeds, your water wheels. Basically, it has that unit that sits out in the water, it floats, and there's a pump on shore, and it sucks the water. So all the stuff skims off the top and it goes back to shore, and it runs through this glorified wheelbarrow looking thing with some chicken wire on it. The water runs through the screen, the duckweed watermeal gets hung up on it. The water runs back down the bank into the pond, and all the duckweed and watermeal is left behind. These skimming machines work really good on 1 acre ponds or smaller. You can operate in as little as 18 inches of water. This was a 7,000 square foot pond that we did. It took about 20 hours over the course of 3 days of the machine running. But the real story was we took 10 50-pound burlap bags of duckweed out of this small little pond. Here's a little bigger of a pond, but it's the same thing. You're removing the plants, so you're removing the nutrients. These skimmers don't require any permits. This pond was a little over 1 acre. This was 32 hours over the course of 3 days. One of the disadvantages of this unit is you need electricity. So in this pond, we only had electric on one side. So we ended up on day 3 taking some back blowers and making some artificial wind to blow everything over to where the actual machine was. But, you know, we were able to get everything cleaned up out here. The other thing is you really need to have somebody babysit the machine. That duckweed and water meal, especially in the first day or two, really piles up quick. And you don't want it just falling all over itself and tumbling back down into the pond. You kind of got to get that stuff backed up and get it out of there, or at least shoveled and thrown off to the side. Next, we'll talk a little bit about some biological controls. These are your grass carp, bacteria, light blocking dyes. Grass carp are certainly the most common biological method. They're effective on submerged vegetation. They're marginally effective on floating vegetation. Grass carp will offer a long-term solution. I would say they would consume their weight in the summer. So if you got a 30-pound fish, you'll probably eat about 30 pounds of vegetation in a season. They grow to be over 50 pounds. Their heaviest production of eating, if you will, is from like years 5 through 9. But we got some that are living 15, 20 years. This one was about 55 pounds. That's me. I'm a pretty strong guy. It's a pretty big fish. That fish was only about 12 years old. That's how big they get. Some of the disadvantages to grass carp is they're kind of like kids. They're only going to eat what they want. They're going to eat where they want. We've stocked them before in small ponds. We've overstocked ponds with them with duckweed and water meal, and they'll eat the pachysandra growing along the edge. You know, you can't get them to do what you want. And if you have a large lake and you're looking to have them just eat by the dock, they might not do that for you. So depending on the situation, they'll work. They usually take time. You know, if you say, hey, my pond's 100% covered and it's July 1st, we throw some carp in there, they're not going to eat all their food in 1 year, you know. So it's more of a companion tool. It's a long-term approach to something. Another biological method is bacteria. Natural bacteria in your pond to begin with. These bacteria are specifically designed to work on leaves and the organic matter that are found in the area. They also mix in enzymes, and all that helps to just digest all that organic matter at the bottom of the pond. So now in theory, that nutrient that's in those leaves, if you will, are not leaching out into the water column. They're actually in the enzymes and in the bacteria. The end of the season when they die because the water's too cold, it gets released into the water column. But at that point, all of our vegetation for the season is kind of shutting down for the winter anyway. They're easy to use. Most of the bacteria come in water-soluble packs or come in these large bricks that just kind of break down over time. You don't need any special permits. They're safe for applicators. They're designed to just lower the nutrient levels. It's a season-long thing. You start right as soon as the water temperature gets to 55 degrees. But depending on your goal, depending on your problem, it only reduces nutrients. So if you have a problem in your pond that isn't based around nutrients, the bacteria is not going to help for you. So it's we only usually use it in ponds that, you know, are like algae problems where there's not a lot of other vegetation, nothing's using nutrients. The other thing are light blocking dyes. They function by keeping the sunlight from getting down to the bottom of the pond. So it's disrupting the algae and the submerged plant's ability to do photosynthesis. So it just slows things down. The dyes are non-toxic. Most of the ones we use are food grade, but they don't kill any plants. Everything is you're just looking to slow growth down. So they're safe for irrigation ponds, fishing ponds, swimming ponds. If your dog jumps in afterwards, it's not going to stain your dog or your dock or your rocks or anything like that. So if you had a fountain in it, the water's not going to look black or look blue coming out of the fountain. One of the ways that we use dye is like this customer here, they just didn't like the look of the planktonic algae. They didn't care that it was there. So we dyed the pond kind of heavy to give it more of a blue look instead of the, you know, pea soup green look. We've done it in places like fish ponds, you know, some of these camps and fishing game clubs that have trout or, have koi fish. They don't want the birds coming and jacking their fish. We dye it, and it messes up the depth perception of a lot of these predator birds. So they'll still go after the fish, but it reduces their chance of getting a fish because it just messes with the optics and makes it seem like the fish are shallower than they are. So they come in different colors. Blue and black are the most common. They're relatively inexpensive. You got to start early in the year if you're trying to do it for vegetation control. And then depending on the flow of your pond, if it's a rainier year, if it's a drier year, they can last a long time. Like they don't break down, it just dilutes. So if you have a pond that doesn't really have an inflow or an outflow, you might only have to dye it 2-3 times a year. The biological options really require time, and it has to be specific goal. It has to be a good fit. It has to be a good match. They're usually not a cure-all. A lot of times you got to combine them to get them to work. Because you got to combine them to get them to work, it tends to be a more expensive way of managing a pond. The third type of vegetation control are herbicides. It's the most common for vegetation control. The products are approved by the EPA and by each state. They're easy to apply around docks and just in general. They're easy to apply. They're typically less expensive. They allow you to spot treat or do large lake areas. Usually you don't need special equipment. Herbicides have different modes of action, which allow for species-specific targeting. I can target some pondweed species and leave the lilies. Vice versa, I can target lilies and leave pondweed species. Most are non-toxic for fish and invertebrates. Anytime you read about fish kills around herbicides, it was the guy that messed up. It wasn't the herbicide. When you kill the vegetation with an herbicide, it's taking oxygen to break that down out of the water column. So it ends up being an oxygen loss issue more than anything. So a lot of times we encourage people to do half the pond at a time or a third of the pond at a time. If you start early in the season, it's a non-issue. If you have aeration in your pond, it's a non-issue. The actual herbicide itself is rarely the problem. It was the person doing it. Most are non-persistent and they don't build up in the soil either. Depending on the vegetation, control can be season long. Early season treatments minimize plant growth, allow you to get ahead of things. A lot of times what we'll do is we'll do an early season herbicide application and then allow the biologicals to try and hold on for the remainder of the year. Kind of do a reset, if you will. Hey, it's Father's Day weekend. This week we're going to do a reset on the pond and hope that the bacteria, carp, aeration, die, keep it the rest of the year from becoming a problem. If you do it early, it keeps the nutrients from building up and all the organic matter from dropping out and just starting the cycle over again. Herbicides are usually effective when invasives are concerned because there's really no natural enemy. There's no grass carp the grass carp really don't do much for invasives. There's no grubs. There's no local birds so invasives are a little bit harder. One of the pros of an herbicide application or situation where vegetation is wanted and some is not, we talked before, I can kill the pondweed species growing up from the bottom without doing lilies. It's very difficult to get into a small pond like this to hand remove a bunch of stuff and not affect lilies if that's what you want, or the irises along the shore, or damage your landscape. So it kind of depends on the goal, what you're trying to do. But herbicides allow you to be a little bit more specific. Obviously, chemical controls have a disadvantage too. Most of them have water use restrictions. Swimming and irrigation are certainly the biggest. Most of the ones that are approved in New York, though, are only 24 hours. So typically we can work around that. Rainy days, hey, we're going to do this on a Monday, something will be closed, whatever the math is, you're able to work around it. Depending on the herbicide, it might take a while to work. Some of them are slow, which is good because it's a slow breakdown of the material. But at the same time, if you're trying to get married or do something on Saturday and you do an herbicide application, you might not get the results by that. In New York State, you need to be a licensed applicator to buy and to apply the herbicides. And depending on the herbicide and the size of the pond, you might need to get a permit as well. The fourth type of management is aeration. Aeration is the process of adding oxygen to water. Maintaining healthy amounts of oxygen is the most important water quality consideration. That oxygen aids in the breakdown of the decaying vegetation. We talked about the bacteria before. They need lots of oxygen in order to thrive. Fish need lots of oxygen in order to thrive. So the more oxygen, the more fish that you can have. Also, the higher amounts of oxygen that are in the water column, it makes the phosphorus not bioavailable for the plants. So you could have a pond that does have a lot of phosphorus in it, but by really increasing the oxygen, it's just not available for plants to use. Some of the disadvantages are the upfront costs. They tend to be a little expensive for larger bodies of water. You need to have electricity. That electricity is going to be in the water, which is always a nightmare. There are some solar options for these fountains, but they're not that good yet. I wouldn't recommend that. And also, depending on your vegetation problem, they might clog. The other type of aeration is diffused aeration. This is what you would use in larger, deeper ponds. They're used to destratify the water column, get oxygen directly to the bottom of the pond. They work by having an air compressor on shore that runs air through these hoses to this diffuser head, which is a glorified shower head, if you will. It gives a natural look to the pond. It just looks like there's a small spot boiling. The diffusers are quiet. There's less maintenance with them. There's no winter removal. If you do have to work on them, the unit's on shore. You don't have to get a boat to pull something in. They use less electricity. Air tubing is cheaper to run than electric lines. So you could put the compressor by your house and run the air line 2,000 feet down to your pond, or from a park bathroom to a pond. You can run them underground. Also, diffusers have solar capabilities because they don't use as much electricity and don't have the amp draw. You're able to use solar panels. We've installed a bunch of solar diffusers in cemeteries where electricity isn't just available all over. They tend to be more expensive, but depending on how far you have to run electricity, you'll eat that up just and bring in electric. In general, diffusers are good because they don't clog. There's no electricity in the water. If somebody was fishing and hit the line, or you were doing some work and hit the line, it's air bubbling up in the water. You can go, hey, there's my problem. And a lot of times electric tape fixes a fish hook or a small little cut in the air hose. A lot of people leave them running year round. You just got to remember to put an air filter in them once a year. They're super simple, nice and quiet. The small ones that have electric are really subtle. An ornamental grass can hide the thing. You don't even see it. You don't even know it's there. There's one other type of aerator. We call them like industrial aerators. They're non-decorative. All they do is just turn the water over. This is like a 3 horsepower unit, and that water is maybe 2 feet off the water. They tend to be cheaper. All they do is just add oxygen. Turn the water over, turn the water over. We find that with this surface disruption like this, it cuts down on mosquitoes. They're less likely to get clogged because there's no ports or jets or nozzles that sucks up the algae that they would get hung up in. It just runs it through and pushes it straight out. They're good for office parks, recreational areas, or situations where you don't need it to be a distraction. Some golf courses like to have this because they don't want you to have to hit over a fountain. We have a couple homes that put them in because the sound of the water drowns out some of the traffic. So again, it's just a different option. Just like anything else, it's necessary to combine management techniques. We get hit over the head with BMP, but it applies. You start out, you figure out what your problem is, figure out what your goal is, figure out what your expectation is. And then that's going to dictate the management options. Typically, we tell people to start with aeration. And then depending on the pond or the problem, we move to carp, bacteria. If you don't have aeration in a pond, I don't think bacteria are going to help you at all, because they really just require that oxygen. And if you have enough water flowing through, like if it's a good sized stream, brook, river coming through, it's probably going to flush out the bacteria more than you can say you're benefiting from the oxygen and cold water that's coming in from that. Then we move to dyes, and then lastly, herbicides. We spoke before about sometimes we reset a pond in the beginning and try and keep the biologicals going up after that. Sometimes it's the other way around. It just depends on what the weed problem is and what the goals are. Size of the pond, everything. Regulations impact what we do as well. Wetlands in New York State require different approvals. We have some bodies of water where we're not allowed to do anything till noon because there's bald eagles that fish there and they don't want us bothering the eagles. We have other spots where you can't start doing work till June 1st because there's a frog that spawns and you have to wait. So sometimes we can sit and look on paper and say, this is what we want to do. And regulation tells us, nah, you got to wait. You got to do it this way. I've had places that encouraged us to actually do more aggressive herbicide stuff with invasives and manage natives biologically on the other end of it. A lot of times I try and start with biologicals, but depending on what the problem is, it might be worth getting ahead of it and doing a reset or being aggressive now, knowing, hey, if I got 5 years into this pond, the first 2 of them are aggressive, maybe on the backside, I can have a little less of a problem. Invasive species in general are typically harder to control. And when I talked to Matt about doing the talk, I was like, hey, what do you think I should talk about? He mentioned invasives, and he mentioned that a couple of the groups or the committees, I'm not quite sure which, dealing with water chestnuts this year, kind of for the first time. So I just wanted to talk about a couple of specific invasive species and some of the options. So this is a lake up by me. I'm up in Sullivan County. It's a 400-acre lake, and we're looking at 120 acres, Google Earth picture, if you will, of it. And that's all water chestnut. And it's growing in anywhere from 1 foot to about 8 feet. And you can see that this picture was actually taken after we did the herbicide application. You can see our boat paths. But the one thing that I wanted to show you is that the reason there's nothing growing between the shoreline and out in the water is because we did a winter drawdown the year before. We draw the water down about 2 feet. That showed a bunch of the shoreline got exposed. And water chestnut seeds are really susceptible to being frozen. If they freeze even for 2 to 3 days, we found, where they get to be about 25 degrees, they're not going to grow the next year. That should be pretty easy. 25 degrees for 3 days should be pretty easy, even in Rockland County. Smaller ponds are easy to put a siphon in, and you got to fill up the pipe, and then it'll siphon itself out. If in early December, early January, that you're getting a little cold snap coming through, water chestnut is a problem, or even other plant species, a little winter drawdown, quick thing, especially if you have a concrete dam or you have a pipe or you have some boards and it's just a matter of taking some boards out. It's pretty easy. So water chestnuts are an annual. So if you get rid of the seeds, you got nothing coming back the next year. Water chestnuts will grow in probably about 15 to 18 feet of water. I know they're growing in the Hudson River. They're growing in 8 feet of water. But if you cut the plant at the bottom because of the flow, some of them are measuring to be 18, 20 feet long from root to actually rosette at the top. Water chestnuts are easy to control with herbicides as well. There's about 4 active ingredients that work on water chestnuts. But grass carp aren't going to do anything. Hand pulling is really good if you can get there before like July 1st. You want to do it even before it starts flowering. We had a pond where we did it a little bit late. It had flowered. We had everything piled up on shore. By the time the guy came with the mini excavator, because it had rained enough, those plants kept growing, and those seeds actually produced with it just being piled up on shore. So you want to kind of get it before it even starts flowering. But because it's an annual, you can kind of get ahead of it. Another invasive species that I know hits kind of locally is Phragmites. I read a whole bunch of stuff about the Piermont Marsh project, and let's face it, they're growing all over the place. There are a couple of non-glyphosate options for Phragmites. There's a product called ClearCast. It's a selective herbicide. It's specifically designed for use in water. We would use it to use, actually treating in water. We've sprayed it where you have to put it in hoses, so it's along the bottom of a pond. So it's designed to be in water. With Phragmites, you want to work on them in the fall. Anything that you do in the summertime, the translocation going up is so strong in Phragmites, you would just be burning the plant. If you do something in the fall, it's pulling everything down to the roots. And we've had situations where we were able to do one full treatment with ClearCast and Phragmites, and then in the spring do a small touch-up, and we've eradicated them. There are some machines like this Marshmaster that's an amphibious vehicle that have a brush hog that goes behind it that actually can run in water. They have a big barrel behind. This one has a barrel attachment that has these discs on it. So you can go through in the wintertime and bust it up. And because you're getting all that dead material knocked down, it allows the native species to start growing sooner and can kind of help out. Phragmites actually start a little bit late, which is unique for an invasive species. So if you can get everything cut down, even if it's in a small area with a circular saw blade on a weed whacker is what we use when we need to do it around a dock. If you get that stuff cut down and cleaned up, it allows some of the native species to kind of get a foothold. With chemicals and with cutting, you can get rid of frags 1 to 3 years. You can get 90% control. If you're just doing mowing, you know, it's more of a 5-year plan. We typically do the cutting and stuff in the wintertime. It minimizes impacts to animals. And it, you know, none of the birds are there, none of the ducks are there, none of the turtles are there, none of the animals are there. So we try and do all the cutting when it's, you know, straight up wintertime. Also, it's selfishly, it's easier to walk out on the ice to do stuff, and the ground is solid to do stuff. You can cut this stuff down and rake it up out. I've had places just actually burn it. You know, if it's a small area, you just go and just take a propane torch and burn it. I know I talked fast. I wanted to leave some time for some questions and stuff. Thanks again for having me. Let me see if I can do this here so that I can get it so that I can see what the questions are here.
Thank you, James.
Hey, you're welcome.
And I had one quick question regarding your references slide. Earlier on in the presentation, you mentioned the Texas A&M, Purdue, and Wader's Digest weed ID resources. Are links to those included in the references slide?
No, but I can send them. I can email them to you afterwards.
That'd be great. Thank you.
Anybody had any specific questions about projects that they're working on or anything?
Yeah, so James, I'm gonna, there were a few comments made throughout your presentation. Since we have a smaller group, I'm gonna ask actually Ray, if you're available, if you can unmute yourself and just share your experience and some of the comments you wrote in the chat.
Gee, thanks. I'm with Suez Water, New Jersey division, and we've had a lot of these. Interesting, you put that Swan Lake up there. We have a reservoir in Lambertville, New Jersey called Swan Lake.
Oh, okay.
And we used, I think, last 2 years Captan, I believe, for the water chestnuts down there. Plus, we've done harvesting. Maybe not Captan for that. I have to review that. Excuse me?
ClearCast?
ClearCast. Captan was one of the proposals for the algae control. Correct. Thank you. And we did a harvesting by hand. It's only a 25-acre lake, which is, you know, it's daunting, but it's not a 1,000-acre lake. So we've done hand harvesting, mechanical harvesting this past year, just to keep some control. When we have used the ClearCast, we took the reservoir out of service for well over a month. and did monitoring for any residuals. We wanted to keep it below 1 part per billion residual before we put it back into service. So I think we got non-detects when we finally put it back into service. We went to an alternate supply. Closer to home, Lake Tappan Reservoir, we have about 40 acres of the reservoir there covered with water chestnuts. And as the seeds come down further downstream, certainly concerned about getting into our terminal reservoir down in New Jersey, Oradell Reservoir, where the intake is. And both Lake Tappan, Oradell Reservoir are relatively shallow with an average depth of maybe max about 11 feet. So it could take over probably 50% or more of each surface reservoir, which is close to 1,000 acres. We did a mechanical harvesting of water chestnuts at Lake Tappan, taking out over 2 million pounds of water chestnuts over like a 2-week period, just to get some control. And can I come right back? I have a call to take, sorry.
Thank you, Ray. James, did you have any comments on Ray's items before we move on to the next question?
Yeah, I mean, certainly water chestnut is going to be the thing that, you know, keeps me making my mortgage payments here over the next 10 years or so. The seed just lasts forever. You know, if it stays in the water, it can wait 5 years before it wants to germinate. So in that way, you know, anytime we see water chestnut, you know, it's a minimum, it's a 5-year plan of like, hey, if nothing else, we at least have to look at this pond, you know, on June 1st every year to see. And as I said a couple of times, you know, a lot of times it's a combination effect. So, you know, there's going to be times where it works out where you can use herbicide, you know, depending if you're not in a drought and you have alternative water sources, you know, his situation is unique with the reservoir. You can shut one off. That works out great. Hey, we can get to use herbicide this year. If it's a drier season, you know, if it's a dry spring or a dry winter and you're going in and you're already nervous about the amount of water, you know, hey, looks like we might have to, you know, manually do it this year. So the ClearCast works very well. I don't know what their limitations are there. Most of the products now have a test associated with it. So if nothing else, you know, everybody on paper goes, yeah, okay, that's great. You said in 3 days it's not going to be there anymore. We can drink the water, you know, prove it. A lot of them now have tests. So you can say, hey, look, on Wednesday, I'm going to come test the water. You know, give me till Friday for the results. If nothing else, you know, an independent lab said it's at this. And, you know, we have to take everybody at face value that this is the safest it can be now with the known information that we got. And so in a way that's helpful with some of the herbicides now. We tend to do stuff early in the weeks so that we can get the water test back within that week, you know. And, you know, that's usually pretty helpful. So, but yeah, water chestnuts are a big thing. Their spiny hooks can easily get hung up in a goose. Some of them float, you know, so you can get them going over the spillway. Like he said, it was going down the river. That lake that I showed a picture of, I would say half of their funds comes from the lake that's actually downstream, because they're like, we don't want this in our lake. So we're going to help you out.
Thank you. Another comment Ray had in here was regarding the use of stocking the triploid carp, and that there were negatives that outweighed the positives. Are you able to provide any clarity on that, James, from your point of view? And then maybe when Ray comes back later, we could have him share.
Yeah, absolutely. It depends on what you're trying to do if they work. It's certainly not a clear. We've also had situations in which you can overstock them. So, okay, we got a real bad problem. We want to do it with grass carp. We want to get ahead of this. And people, instead of stocking at a mid rate, so, you know, we tend to be 8 to 12 fish an acre. Sometimes they'll get overzealous and, you know, they'll put more in. We've had lakes where, okay, the pond connection is going to get you grass carp, and then on the side, other people went and filed permits for their brother's pond or whatever to get grass carp and then throwing them in the lake. That picture of me holding the grass carp was us going and we were doing an electric shock and actually taking some out because they had overstocked. And so now there's no submerged vegetation, there's no floating vegetation, so all that nutrients are there, and that's when you get algae bloom. So they can be bad that way. They're technically vegetarians. I've had a couple people make the argument that, hey, James, you told me that the fish are laying the eggs on the underside of the leaves, and now you got a grass carp coming and eating the leaf. Is that fish really spitting out those fish eggs or those invertebrate eggs? And you know, so you can make an argument that if you overstock, there's not a lot of vegetation and the carp are eating it, they're eating the eggs, and you can have a negative impact with your real fish. I guess you could make that argument in certain situations. You know, I would have a hard time saying that that's not happening. So, but they tend to be cheap. They tend to stay in ponds. DC in New York asked us to put up a fence at the outlet for the first season, if you will, to just remind the fish that that's where they want to be. But they're pond fish, they're not river fish, so they tend to stay. But yeah, I could definitely cite incidents where people have overstocked or put in for the wrong thing and not had good results, or, you know, why did we do this? You know, this is becoming a problem.
Thank you, James. And Ray, while you were talking on your call, I just read out your comment to James regarding the negatives outweighing the positives. So if you wanted to share what you found some of the negatives to be as well, feel free.
It was a while ago that we looked into the carp for control. We don't have that much until water chestnuts, and you say that they're not effective on that. We decided it wasn't advantageous to put in the carp, and certainly, like regular carp, they're the geese of the aquatic world, just eating vegetation and defecating and just returning those nutrients in there. So you know, that is one of our main issues, is the nutrient loading to our lakes to exacerbate the algae blooms. So that was the thing, not using
certainly if you have an algae problem or a lily problem, water chestnuts, you know, the carp aren't going to do anything except, you know, mess you up. And, you know,
we do have spatter dock in the area of the water chestnut, also a lot of spatter dock, which isn't bad. It's pretty dense, but I'd rather deal with the spatter dock, have the spatter dock there than the water chestnuts. I've tried to draw down the lake at times to before the seed set to kill, and from the natural, it's a very shallow part of the reservoir, so just naturally sometimes the lake level drops down so that it dries out the plants except for the main channel of the river that remains. So that has controlled the water chestnuts from blossoming even further. But we are seeing them downstream in some locations, especially with storms. They break off the plants, and we found them downstream of the Lake Tapan Dam, which then goes down the river into the Oradell Reservoir. So there is a concern there. And even at the Woodcliff Lake Reservoir, upstream of that is a pond owned by a town that has water chestnuts in it now. So we're getting surrounded by it. It's only a matter of time before all of our reservoirs have this. So we put up signs at our fishing gates asking people if they see something, fishermen and fisherwomen, if they see this plant, to report it to us so we can be proactive and remove it so it doesn't get out of control. And we have aeration, large aeration. One reservoir is submerged. Other ones are towers, basically to keep the anaerobic conditions or the bottom of the reservoirs from going anaerobic, which is mainly for water quality concerns, iron and manganese. And that's been successful, and we're currently looking at replacing our aeration system that was originally installed over 15 years ago with a new aeration system in one of the reservoirs.
Very good.
It's just some of the measures that we've been undertaking. And obviously we treat with copper sulfate products for algae control so it doesn't get up. And certainly with HABs these days, it's more important than ever.
Sure.
Thank you, Ray. Our next question is from Matt. Can you unmute yourself and ask your question for the recording?
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can, Matt.
Okay, thanks. Because I'm kind of doing dual. I got my video going, but I'm using the phone for audio. But yeah, James, I had two questions. One was a lot of people in the county are testing for water and was wondering what is the amount of phosphorus that's ideal for algae control. So above what level would be too much, I guess, is the question. And then how easy is it to identify the difference between duckweed and watermeal? Is it easy to look at it and tell the difference?
Okay, good. So phosphorus, I'm going to give a vague answer and everybody's going to get annoyed, but it depends on what else is in the pond. If you have a lot of vegetation that isn't algae, you're going to have a higher phosphorus load when you take water tests, because in theory, all those plants are taking the phosphorus. So there's a lot of things sharing that amount of phosphorus. If you have an empty pond or you're under 20%, phosphorus number needs to be lower. So in theory, if I went and took a water sample of a pond on Mother's Day, May 15th, that means that really our native vegetation should be start growing. In the beginning of them starting to grow, they're using the most amount of nutrients that they possibly can. And it's anything over like 20, I would say that, that's too much. Unfortunately, in New York State right now, there's not much they're allowing you to do with phosphorus. And the math behind that is because if I said to you, hey, I got this product that is going to bind up the phosphorus so that you have less algae, I'm using that as an algicide and it needs to be labeled as such. None of these companies want to say, yeah, it's an algicide, because they're actually just binding up phosphorus. So in Jersey, Connecticut, PA, you're allowed to put products in the water like Phosla, there's buffered alum, there's another one called biochar, which is basically like a charcoal. It just, I think phosphorus is positively charged. I think this is negatively charged, so it just grabs it, kind of similar like a cation exchange kind of thing with magnesium or calcium. They bind up and they're just bound because of but in New York, we really can't do anything about it today. They're doing some tests and stuff on some lakes last year and the year before to determine what the adverse impacts of these are. But, anything over a 20, you start getting jammed up with algae problems. Then specific to duckweed and watermeal, they can be tricky. But I would say this, if you have a pond that's got either any type of floating vegetation on it, try and stick your hand in the water, slowly pull it up so that it sticks to your hand so that you can get a good look at it. Watermeal does not, it's one leaf. It's one speck of a thing. It's the size of a pencil tip. Duckweed has multiple leaves on it. Sometimes it's 2, sometimes it's 3. Think about it as clover. You can go and pick a piece of clover out of the ground. It's got 2 on it, 1 on it, 3 on it, 5 on it. Watermeal never has more than 1. Watermeal is gritty. If I put my hand in the water and pulled it up and my eyes were closed and I went like this, I could feel it. It feels like cornmeal or something in your hand, like you got something on your hand, like you were making pizza dough or something that got all crumbly. Duckweed doesn't feel like that. It's almost slimier. So those are a couple things that if I'm on the phone with somebody and I'm trying to go through it with people and I can't see, I'm like, hey, how does it feel in your hand? What are you looking at? That kind of deal. So technically, they're easy to identify if you know the 2 things to look for. But yep, the amount of leaves are the dead giveaway.
Thanks, James.
You're very welcome.
Matt, did you have any other questions? If not, I can go on to Brianna and Hannah, who have questions in the chat.
Yeah, no, that's it. Thanks. The other ones, James already answered.
Thank you. Brianna, you could unmute yourself and read your question aloud.
Hi, I had a question about the light blocking dyes. I think when you initially brought it up, and maybe I misunderstood, it sounded like that was more of a cosmetic. People don't like the way that it looks, so it changes the color. But then you also mentioned that it does throw off like the optics for the birds, so they're less likely to catch a fish. So does that have like any impact on, I guess, like people who are visiting the pond with their dogs who like might see it and be like, wow, this looks so nice, and their dog like goes into it or anything like that?
All right, very good questions. All those things are things that I did talk about. So people use it to keep fish in the pond, to keep birds from coming to get their trout or their koi fish. So that is a use for it. People use it to keep sunlight from going in to slow down growth. And people use it too because sometimes ponds are muddier looking or just have, the green look to it from algae. And they go, look, you know what? I don't really want to deal with that. I'd rather it look black or blue. I'm fine with that. Let's let this go. Specific to your dog, unless your dog, cat, whatever kid went in the exact second that I put the product in, it's not going to stain them. It's not going to hurt them. They can drink the water. Usually I ask people to give it like 10 minutes to just kind of mix around and swirl, but we've never had a situation in which somebody's come out looking all smurfed up or your dog smurfed up or all black. Sometimes it happens to me in a concentrate form, like if my glove, I put my thumb through the top. I'm wearing a glove to make the foil seal come off. I rip the glove, of course, and then my thumb is black. But that's the concentrate. We've never had a situation in which, the water, when it's applied to any amount of water, even if you're using it off rate, where you're like, I'm just going to put one in, even though it said 1 per acre, and I only got 1/10 of an acre. Even our equipment doesn't stain. So, like if we spray it out or something, because they have liquid and they have water soluble packs. So, no, we encourage it in parks and ponds and stuff, and in public areas, just because it's like, hey, we're trying to do all we can non-chemically to keep the pond and vegetation in check.
So is it more so it's used as like a preventative? Okay, I think I misunderstood. I thought it was something being used once you have like all this visible algae to like make it, you can use it like that too?
You can use it like that. So in a perfect world, you start using it on April 15th when all the snow and ice and everything's all melted away and everything's calmed down with the weather. But that use is to prevent stuff from growing. But say you didn't know that you had a problem. Your pond is now lime green with planktonic algae. One of the things that you can do to kind of curb the aesthetic of that is to dye it so that, hey, you know what, that looks like a shade of blue now or a shade of black now. And it, if some people just don't care that it looks green or why it's green, they just don't want to see it green. And hey, I don't want to use herbicides or algicides, or there's nothing I can do about it. I don't have the money, whatever it is. That's a way of kind of painting the pond, if you will, painting over your problem a little bit for an aesthetic look.
But it's like the algae itself, it's not harmful then? Like okay, all right, cool. Thank you.
Thank you, Brianna and James. Then we'll move on to Hannah. You could unmute yourself.
Hi, my question was, do you choose different management methods depending on the presence of ducks and geese? Like, are some of them more harmful or just easier to manage when you know that there are birds there?
Specific to birds, the only thing that I would say is, I try and discourage geese. So if I was doing something, my management option might include things to discourage geese. But specific to birds, as far as like products and it affecting bird health, birds, frogs, turtles, anything that can kind of get out of the water are the hardest things to actually hurt. Let's pretend that the herbicide that we're using is technically not supposed to hurt anything, but it wasn't mixed right. There was some problem with the applicator. Birds, frogs, stuff, they can get out of the water. They can leave that site. Fish can't. So usually I kind of look at, are there any sensitive fish there? And use them as my canary, if you will, to say, hey, look, I got to be prepared for this, and then work outwards to things that can leave. Like I rarely think about deer because they can move on. I rarely think about ducks, geese, things like that, because if they didn't like that water body, they could easily leave and move on. There's there's nothing that the EPA or the government is going to approve that where it's a, you touch the water, you die immediately kind of thing for any, you know, any aquatic use, certainly, because there's so many variables on how it can leave. So specific to ducks and geese, I don't necessarily think about them. A lot of the contact herbicides are all driven around photosynthesis. So if you wanted to make the, if you wanted to draw the line where, hey, an insecticide works to the nervous system of killing this insect. So now you have a mouse or something else that gets that in it. Couldn't you say that it would affect its nervous system? Yes, I can draw that line. If I have an herbicide that it's affecting photosynthesis or its ability, a plant's ability to use chlorophyll to, you know, in photosynthesis, I have a harder time drawing the line to it's going to mess up tadpoles because tadpoles aren't using photosynthesis. So with the information that I got, the situations, I usually think of it that way. What am I doing? What's here? But usually the thing that I'm worried about because they can't move. And that goes to when we were talking before about doing half a pond or a third of a pond at a time, because now in theory, there's a spot that they can go to. But ducks are really a lot of times, you know, ducks aren't, even when they're in the water's not touching them, you know, it's touching their feet, but the feathers, everything else is, you know, insulated, you know, they're waxed out, if you will. So if they're eating a plant that technically has herbicide in it, usually all that stuff is based around plant and photosynthesis, and cell reproduction in plants, and not necessarily, I would certainly be nervous with an insecticide or a mosquito control with ducks, fish that way, because that's usually more of a nervous system or a protein in a cell wall that you could draw the line to be like, wait a minute, man, if this thing eats all the mosquitoes here, if there's one duck and it eats all of it, couldn't that accumulate in it? And aren't we creating problems? You know, the whole DDT thing with the eagles, you know, it's just bioaccumulating. So I would be nervous with an insecticide, less nervous with herbicide.
Thank you, James. And Hannah, did that answer your question?
Yeah, exactly. Thank you so much.
Great. James, I actually had two questions. The first is kind of from an education standpoint. I was curious if you or any of the sites that you worked with created any signage to explain either the identification tools that you can do or even the processes that you use so that the public were more informed.
Yes, a lot of times we have to put signs up in New York State when we do herbicide application saying, hey, look, this portion of this lake was treated. This is what it was treated with. Here are the restrictions. We have other signs that we do that are more of an education outreach. Hey, this is the boat launch. Water chestnut has been known here to be here. This is what the seed is. It's going to get hung up on the ratchet strap of the boat or the rope for your anchor and stuff. Look to get rid of that. We've worked with people before to do like the boat wash station or like, hey, how can we create an area where, okay, everybody cleaned off their boat, you know, but if all that stuff is just piled up sitting there on the boat ramp and it rains and those seeds go in or something like that, that doesn't help anybody. So, you know, we've worked to help design, like just dig a hole right next to the boat ramp so that somebody could sweep it in or at least make an effort to kick it in. You know, maybe you get a little extra effort for some people and it's now in this hole next to it. So even something as simple like that we've done. I would say 90% of my customers, we have to do some type of Zoom, some type of walkthrough, especially anytime an herbicide is concerned, you know, to let people know that it's not everything is Roundup. This isn't all glyphosate, you know, Monsanto isn't the one doing the application, and an education like that. We've done things on our website. We have some of our stuff gets an email blast to the homeowners association where it's like, hey, look, on Tuesday, we're supposed to come. Here are one of our two options that we're going to do. If it's sunny, this is what we're going to do. If it's not, this is what we're going to do. So it's hard to make like the pamphlet to say, hey, look, if you got duckweed, here's your pamphlet. Here's all your education, because everybody order is different. Your goal is different. Your budget is different. You know, certainly, you know, a $10 million house, you know, with a little half-acre pond is going to be able to yeah, I'll put a $10,000 fountain in, versus, some park that's, got a dollar jar at the gas station trying to raise funds to get the fence painted. It's all different. That lake, that Swan Lake that I showed you, they do ice fishing contests, and they got big signs out there that say, hey, look, if we get 100 people that comes here, that treats this 10 acres that you're ice fishing on, and they got like they got some road cones and some spray paint out on the ice going, hey, this funded this treatment today in this area, and it makes a fun thing that way where people are like, oh, good, Saturday got this cove done, that kind of deal. So education and fundraising and little things come in all kinds of unique ways. So, and that's certainly part of it. Education from both ends. We've really benefited lately with Facebook, and people with drones have really helped us out, because we'll get people just flying drones around a lake, chasing their buddy water skiing or something like that. And they'll send in the video going, hey, we had some fun on the lake, and I can see something off in the distance, or even depending on the sunlight, the angle, you can see underwater to see vegetation. I'm like, geez, man, I thought we did a better job there. Or, hey, we haven't been there yet. That looks like it's ready to break the surface. And so even something like, we have somebody that we literally pay just to monitor Facebook of all of our associations, and, tag them with their pictures and look to see who's in the, boy, Nancy's dock is always the area that pops first, and she just put up some pictures and that looks good. And hey, they put that note in our notes like, hey, look, you can skip going to Nancy's for a while because, she put a picture up on Facebook and it looks good. So we've benefited a lot from that lately. So, all kinds of education, in both directions.
Thank you. And my second question has to do with how the management styles may differ in streams from lakes and ponds. So I believe that it was shared with you that there's some sightings of some vegetation in some of our streams throughout Rockland County, and how could we prevent the spread of that into more downstream locations, as well as how can we prevent from lakes and ponds getting into our connecting streams, and how those methods might change in a more shallow urban stream versus a wider, more natural stream.
Yeah, streams are, the other thing that's going to keep me in business, because stuff flows. If you're at the bottom, it's tough. When you manage stuff in streams, it's as much about monitoring as about what you're actually doing. A lot of times having a lot of roads cross a stream in general are bad for a river, but they're great when it comes to monitoring, because you can ask anybody to drive over that bridge to go, hey, do you see this growing in the water? And it's easy to go, okay, well, it took a year for them to go to here. Therefore, we can extrapolate out that it'll take 3 years to get to here, or this is moving much faster. We need to put more of an emphasis on the stream work than we are on the lake work. But doing stuff in water, moving water, is very difficult. When I spoke about all the hand removal and stuff, if those fragments are going downstream, it really makes manual removal difficult without setting up nets, without setting up catch stuff kind of way downstream. So if you said, all right, well, we're going to work on this spot, we'll set up a net down another 50 feet. We've also admitted to yourself that you're okay, that it could spread 50 feet further down by setting up that net. And to have the net exactly right behind you where you're working is cumbersome. It gets in the way. Some streams don't allow for you to put a net across. If the water's really moving, or it's just not deep enough, or if it's a wavy, everybody likes to think about it being a perfect V. If we drew a picture and I said, yeah, just get a net, put a weight here, I'm going to draw a perfect V, and streams aren't like that. You can't leave it up for more than a day. You wouldn't trust it to be up overnight, somebody to mess with it. Like, you couldn't come back to it. So, you have to make sure that you're done that day. It certainly creates a nightmare with moving stuff. There are situations in which you can drip herbicide. Don't do that. I know that one of our competitors is doing that down kind of like by Terrytown. And they got I want to say there's like a 3-mile stretch of one of the rivers feeding into the Hudson River where they got a tote of an herbicide sitting in the river, chained up with chain, and it's got a solar powered drip where it just gives a little squirt, every 10 minutes or so of something, and that goes downstream, and that's how they're trying to combat. That was hydrilla, so a big invasive from the south, but that's technically a way to do it. But rivers are tough, and depending on the watershed, it's very difficult to put even a chain link fence across the top of a dam to say, hey, look, we don't want anything coming over, because the rain event that led to that vegetation, that 6-inch column of water now coming up over top of the dam, it's going to take any chain fencing or any netting that you have with it. All that's going to do is collect all of it, and now you got a big bale of vegetation going downstream. So usually what we try and do is start at the top and just work your way down. And depending on the situation, ask the people that are downstream to consider that as part of their water body, and say, hey, look, we need the funding, we need the help, we need the manpower, we need the permission. A lot of times it's just getting everybody on board. A lot of times we get jammed up more with politics and with neighborly fighting, and oh yeah, I'll give you permission to treat the lake and stuff like that. When you get rid of that tree, I've been asking you to get rid of it. It's rarely finances that jams up property. It's people. People become a problem. Politics become a problem. Crossing town lines, village lines. You guys are all working in towns, and the politics. I'm sure the little things that you deal with, even with a park, or so. Streams are very difficult, but try and start at the top and work your way down. And like the first part of this conversation was, education. The email list that exists now, the postcards that you can send out saying, hey, look, by the way, this reservoir up here, this lake or this pond's got something. It's coming downstream to you. We put this committee together. We put this together to start managing it. Please get involved. And this is the 4 things that you can do. Just even if it's take a picture of your stream once a month for me on the first of the month, and email it to me. That helps so much, just getting that extra information. So.
Thank you, James. That was helpful. And the presentation was very good. So if everyone wants to unmute themselves real quick, just to give James a nice round of applause, we'll get that on video, and then I'll switch it over to Matt.
Okay.
Thank you.
You sure? Yeah. Thanks, James.
You're very welcome. You're going to have my email address. You'll have the way to contact me if somebody thinks of something later on they want to email. There'll be lots of ways to get in contact. So thank you very much. I appreciate the opportunity. I'm going to hang out for a little bit and listen to the other problems that you guys are dealing with.
New York is, I think, too stringent when it comes to things like you mentioned about biochar. We're looking at that in New Jersey, using biochar at inlets to the reservoirs, floating islands and such. But yeah, I think they're a little bit too stringent.
Yep.
Hey, we got one more question, James.
Sure, go ahead.
Yeah, hi, I'm Jim Elling from the Water Quality Committee. I was wondering if there's any connection, if this is possible, about TSOs, excuse me, or illicit discharges. Is there a connection? Have you ever detected immediately or surmised that the discharges might be causing some water chestnut infestation? Is that something?
I would say that there may be correlations between a lot of things specific to water chestnut, but I would say that the reason that we're seeing such an explosion in water chestnut, the overriding theme would be its seed is so persistent and lasts for such a long time, and its ability to get hooked on anything. Geese are hanging out now. They're not going all the way south for the winter as much. So you could have a goose spreading water chestnut in November because that seed is sitting on the shoreline or in the mud or something. So I would say it's just the ability for that seed to be able to germinate 5 years out that's showing this explosion in water chestnut. And then specific to New York, the DC has certainly changed some of their rules recently And it's kind of made it a little bit harder to deal with larger bodies of water with water chestnut from an herbicide standpoint. So it's, in a way, they're almost discouraging people to tackle it. So I would say specific to water chestnut, I think it's just, it's more of a, because of the plant than anything that we're necessarily doing. But I'm sure we can go to any town, go anywhere and point to something and go, well, that's not helping. You know, that exists with everything. So certainly, but overall, water chestnut, it's spreading, its explosion. And this talk we do 5 years from now, we'll be talking about water chestnut. It's because of the plant more than anything, I would say.
Great, thanks.
Very well.
All right, thanks again, James.